crush me with your hand. So just tap me with your finger, and I'll understand. So just tap me with your finger, I won't overflow again. I'm not who you think I am. Whoa. They call me sort of pop can man. Whoa. 'Cause I don't do well with pressure. It's such a friendly gesture now. Just get me out of the freezer. And don't give me the cold shoulder. 'Cause I am just a fragile man. I'm a castle made of sand. Here comes the tide again to wash me out to sea again. I'm not who you think I am. Whoa. They call me sort of pop can man. Whoa. 'Cause I don't do well with pressure. Such a friendly gesture.
Who's there?
now. Just keep me out of the freezer. And don't give me the cold shoulder. 'Cause I am just a
I'm waiting for somebody.
Whoa.
Let's see.
You could crush me.
Oh, this is funny. So I was on a, let's see if I can fix this stupid thing. Okay. I was on watching my friend's channel, and they were interviewing Daryl Bach from, I think he works for Dallas Theological Seminary, maybe. He's highly published. And I asked him my weird questions, and he obliged. I posted it, but I'm going to play it real quick. I'm waiting for somebody. Let's see. Let me play it. It's pretty funny. Or it's a pretty good answer, I think. Let's put it that way. Let's see. All right, here it is. Why is it not playing sound? Oh. What a nice introduction. Oh, there it goes. Check this out, CJ. Check this out. Okay, hold on. This is cool. Maybe, I hope you didn't see it. Let's see. All right, there it is. Okay.
It's key doctrine.
So I would like before I get to the resurrection, we do have an audience question. So Jamie is one of my favorite listeners. He's a good friend of mine, and he brought this question up on a previous episode that we had talked about. How do we understand the humanity and divinity of Jesus? And do you mind taking an audience question? Real quick?
Fine.
Okay, awesome. So Jamie asked, I'll put it up on the screen here. Do you think that the mind of the Logos was fully present in Jesus? How should we think about his humanity and divinity? And then he adds to this, so this is the second part of his question. Where was the mind of the Logos while Jesus was 4 dividing cells in the womb of Mary?
I tell people that when we get to heaven, we're going to be able to have a press conference with God, and we can ask these kinds of questions, and we probably won't care by the time the press conference comes.
Mm-hmm.
But taking it more seriously, the confession of the church is that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. So to the extent he has full human consciousness and he has a divine power and authority, that's combined in his person. What we don't know, this is important to say, what we don't know is how he chose to utilize that structure of who he was.
Okay.
It's clear that in some cases he, I want to say, restricted or limited or did not draw on the access of all the elements and attributes that he had, and then there were times when he did draw on it.
Sure.
So, so to me, the for cell question relates to that's actually not an issue or a problem until we get to human consciousness, and think about it from that kind of way, because at the core of the question is really what's the relationship between the two.
Mhm.
And Jesus chose not to use all the capabilities that he had. I think the Temptations, for example, show that.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, he's constituted this way, but what he's drawing upon
Did you hear that?
as he lives his life is a different deal. So much so that
Yeah.
he's seen as an example of living as authentically human.
Right on.
Uh,
Yeah, go ahead.
And so that's at least the angle I would take, or the trajectory I would take in answering that question.
No, I think you're right. And we have to keep in mind at the same time, for our listeners' sake, that first of all, you have this unique being, namely God, that
Totally unique being. There's never been
nothing
another human being like him.
right, nothing like him in creation. And then this unique being does another unique thing, namely incarnation.
Right.
And so this is something that I have to admit and be honest, I cannot grasp. I believe the Bible whenever we read that God became man. I believe the testimony of the church fathers whenever they say that, and can I understand it? Can I comprehend it? Yes. Can I understand it fully? Absolutely not. And so
Well,
there's
the
gonna be
dynamics are what we don't understand. We can understand the categories and the claim,
right.
but it's the dynamics that we wrestle with, because what we don't know are, like I said, are the choices of limitation that he also undertook, because Philippians 3 talks about him emptying himself and taking on the form of a human being. So
That's right.
was that he clearly has the authority of God and exercises that authority. He clearly has access to the power of God when he chooses to use it, that kind of thing. But what that means across the board there, it's the question the Muslims ask, how can God die?
Mhm.
It's a good question. And that's because of the way in which, obviously he's alive. He's alive even in his human
Pretty
death.
ballsy
Okay?
calling that a good
But
question.
he's also really dead as a human and buried.
Mhm.
So yeah, that would be the way.
It
That was
is a good
cool.
question. Don't get me wrong, but took a lot of chutzpah to admit that.
Yeah, that was cool. Like he gave a really thoughtful answer, and I was like, it's cool that he went to the death thing too. Just like I was like, so I must be a scholar then, I guess. I think people shouldn't be afraid to ask questions like that. People freak out. Like, you just don't bring it up. There's a time and place for it, I suppose. But hello, B.S. Lewis and Nancy. So, what do you make of that answer? Did you notice he said that one part I butted in there? He said something that I thought was interesting. He said, what was it? Do you remember? It was like particular. He said something that a lot of people I think would be freaked out about. I can't think of what it was.
Well, one of the things he said that I thought was interesting was that the question of where was the mind of the Logos when Jesus was foredividing cells in Mary's womb. He said, well, that doesn't really matter until we get to the point of human consciousness, which I thought that was interesting. It's like, so, because I wonder what he means by that. Like, does he mean like that Jesus does not take on the human mind until that point?
I think, you know what I think it was? If I could be so bold as to speak for the man, I doubt he was even thinking about that part of the question. He was thinking ahead to like, how are you God and a human being at the same time? Because notice what he said, and I like it. I thought his answer was good. I just think it's still problematic because because he like said, well, I would almost want to say he had less decision in his use of the divine mind. I actually would lean more towards dependency on the Father. not to downgrade who he is, but to say he seems to want to demonstrate the necessity of depending on God as an example. And so he kind of said, well, because I agree with him, he's God, right? He's the Logos. So, but I wonder how much he had access to the divine mind whenever he wanted. What does that even mean? Like, okay, God, I want, it's like, okay, I'm going to turn it on now. And now it's like God, can God make himself forget something? Like, that's like kind of like lifting a rock so big you can't lift it. Like, God can't like make himself ignorant for like a amount of time. Like, what does that even mean? Like, I'm gonna forget about something for a minute, but I'm gonna set the timer so it comes back in a minute. But during that minute, I absolutely am not God for a minute. You know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it potentially makes sense. It just seems really hard to imagine.
Yeah, I hear that. And a lot of these questions are, there's an old Calvin quote where he says, "Fools go where angels fear to tread."
That's
And
me.
to an extent, you know what I mean? Like, there is sometimes we can be over inquisitive to the point of, asking questions that perhaps don't really matter and can legitimately get us into trouble.
Or lead us into honest truth. Because, look, I don't have any bad agenda. I don't have like a thing in the back of my head going necessarily saying that, at least that I'm aware of, that like where I'm trying to undermine some, that Jesus is divine or something. It just seems like, I'll just tell you straight up, I'm more inclined to want to emphasize his humanity. I think it's more important in the sense that, not ultimately, but in the sense of like how he operated and what he was doing on earth as a human. Not that he didn't have access to the Father and could, I mean, it seems to me like he could do whatever he wants, but notice like he seems to be really dependent on God, right? And so like I would imagine that when he's like going to the cross, there's some sort of like loss of communication potentially. I mean, I've heard reasons to not think that or to think that, but it may be that when he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" is he just saying the words, or does he feel that? You know what I mean? Or like, is he experiencing it? I want to say he's not just quoting the Bible to prove he's messianic. I think David was quoting something that was an actual like experience of the Messiah, and when he experienced it, it came true. It wasn't just like, I'm going to quote that verse so it's true. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. What do you think about that?
I always found that to be a very interesting one. I've heard a lot of people explain, like their own personal opinions on it. Like James White, for example, has said essentially what you had just said, as far as the alternative position, right? That this is just him quoting a Messianic psalm in demonstration of who he is. And
so James White would disagree with me then, you're saying?
Yeah,
he would take that other view. I can see, I've heard him say that, and now that you bring that up, go ahead and tell me what he said. It seemed like he kind of dissed the other side. Like, that tends to be a hyper Calvinist or like a strong Calvinist kind of point of view, but I tend to, that's like a good separator, I would say. I'm not married to that view. I could be wrong. I just tend to think that way, I suppose.
Well, what's interesting about it is there are other Calvinists who've said the opposite, right? Doug Wilson, for example, would be more in line with kind of what you were just saying, where it's like the forsaking there is actually has a little bit more weight behind it than just merely quoting a psalm. I don't really know where I stand on it, to be honest, for a couple of reasons. The first, so on the one end, I'm not 100% sure what it means for God to forsake God. And I know people say, well, yeah, but that's not speaking about a Trinitarian lane. It's like, well, I don't think the Trinity helps in that regard. Like, what does it mean for one divine person to turn his back on the other divine person, each of whom are equal parts of the self same divine being? It's like, I don't fully grasp what that means. You know what I mean? And also at the same time, I don't fully grasp what that would entail either. Like, if Jesus is forsaken of the Father, is that like, I don't know. Is he like separated from the presence of God in a sense, like a la Adam after the garden?
Yeah, hold that thought for a second. And this is the conversation I'm having with. Hey, thank you for coming. Yeah. So I don't know. Can God forsake God? So I'm going to say I don't know for sure. And Jesus certainly had access to the authority that he's always had. But I'm going to say it seems to me that maybe Jesus was more human than we like to think in his role, in his life on earth. And it certainly is very much possible that the connection he had developed while growing as a boy, from like being in the temple and learning the word of God to his, the Garden of Gethsemane, etc. Maybe he lost that. I think he lost that connection. I think he was like a human that's lost their faith as he died. It's possible. That seems to be. I want to take the text to be like him actually experiencing what the text says he's experiencing. Just like I think when he was weeping over Jerusalem, he really was weeping over Jerusalem.
Well, and here's the interesting thing, right? So I was just laying out some like I don't know what that even necessarily means for like I said, for God to forsake God, or for the one divine person to turn his back on the other divine person. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. At the same time, though, it does seem to fit with certain other motifs, right? Like, so for example, Paul talks about, cursed is any man who hangs on the tree, and that Jesus became cursed for us, right? And, I think of how, I know we would probably have a disagreement here, but I consider Jesus to be typologically represented. I was about to say a typological representation, but that'd be the other way around. To be typologically represented by, amongst numerous other sacrifices, the Azazel goat. And one of the things that goat does is it bears the iniquities of the children of Israel. And whereas that's a ritual, Jesus literally did. Like, Jesus actually suffered the penalty that is upon all of us, at least in some capacity.
Yeah, that's why I think he did. Probably, if that's the case, I think essentially it would be through that, because the wages of sin is death, and that is the penalty. And I don't think it's wrong to bring that into it, like the suffering or like the disconnect that, I don't like to talk about it because it's confusing for people because of what I don't want them to think I'm agreeing with them about separation from God being the definition of death, or whatever that even means. I don't think, but there's a sense where I think maybe Jesus experienced that. And so like how much suffering, or what would that feel like? I mean, I don't think it was like God got cut off suddenly, like the mind of God got cut off from God. I think as a human, he had a particular special connection with God, I'm sure, right? Obviously, if he is like more human than people often think. And again, as a caveat, I'm not saying he's not God. I'm saying as his role as the kinsman redeemer, it's kind of like, dude, the definition between a man and God are kind of mutually exclusive. So like, he can't redeem that which he doesn't, take on. So this is where I wanted to go with it next. After you're done with your thoughts, I was curious what you think about the whole flesh thing, the whole pre-Adam, post-Adam flesh sort of thing. What's your thoughts on that too? I guess we've talked about that, but
wait, how exactly do you mean? I guess I'm not.
Okay, so it's like the Christological debate thing where it's okay. So, and it comes into like the Mary thing too, right? Like if Mary was immaculately conceived and all that's part of that plays into it. But like I think most Protestants, evangelicals, whatever, would say Jesus, when he takes on human flesh, he has the flesh like Adam did, like pre-fall Adam flesh, like because like sin is like in the fallen nature. He had the pre-fallen nature human flesh. So some people think if he took on the post-fall flesh, which is kind of what I lean towards, to be honest, and I have some interesting things to say about that, but I think, and like I've heard many church fathers have said, or some first church fathers said, and I know like Warren McGrew would say this too, and he gets a lot of crap for it, but like, and like, because I know Turretin fan and Chapa would say, no, he took on post-fall or pre-fall flesh, because otherwise he would have sin. But obviously no one's saying he had sin when they say he had post-fall flesh. Total depravity comes into play here, how you understand that, etc. It just seems to me he has to he redeems what we have as fallen creatures. That's what it seems like to me. What would
Yeah,
you think?
so I think first off, I think that there's two different ways that could even be interpreted, right? Because if you are a standard young earth creationist, then pre-fall flesh would be immortal. And so certainly it doesn't appear that Jesus was that. Um, in other words, first off, he was literally crucified. So that's obviously mortality. And second off, I do wonder, like, if Jesus, in a hypothetical world, that is, of course, a non-possibility, but in a hypothetical world, if Jesus were to grow to old age, would he have passed away of natural causes? I tend to think the answer is probably yes. And so, in that sense, he's not pre-fall.
That's exactly right. He aged, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
That's an interesting point. I think that's actually, I agree with that totally. Like, that's like, it's a thought experiment, but it's like clearly he would have aged and got, I mean, that just seems scientifically just obviously true.
Yeah, like definitely, right? But then there's another sense in which you could be using that phraseology of pre-fall flesh, which is to say having a sin nature, right? And
Yeah, see, that's the fear here with these people. Like, they think, to me though, if that's nothing that you're guilty of. I mean, in a certain sense.
well, and it gets kind of complicated too, because I think that people have I won't say it's faulty, because I don't think it's developed enough to be right or wrong. But I think they have I'll just kind of said it, an underdeveloped thought process in regards to Adam and Eve. Because let me take you down a dark rabbit trail real quick. That's it, and I think it's totally undeniable. But nevertheless, I think that you'd probably get a lot of flack if you said it. So you know what concupiscence is?
Yeah, it's like the propensity towards sin kind of thing.
Yeah. So
Natural propensity in that plays into this question, right? Exactly.
yeah. So here is a really bizarre question that has an obvious answer that will make you very uncomfortable. Were Adam and Eve concupiscent before the fall?
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day over this question. I was thinking, what does that even mean? Because it gets to the total depravity issue. To me, if you're like totally depraved, you're kind of like a victim. So I tend to like, but then there's like really good reasons to think something like some sort of total depravity of some kind seems to be taught in scripture. So, but what does that even mean? Hey,
Yeah. So let me give the controversial CJ answer, which, by the way, is not limited to myself. A couple other guys, Theodore Beza, R.C. Sproul, have held this position before. If Adam and Eve weren't concupiscent before they sinned, then how did they sin?
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it seems like the answer is kind of, it's uncomfortable, but it's almost obviously yes. Because if they had no propensity to sin, then they wouldn't have. You know what I mean?
It really gets to the free will. It gets to the free will issue really fast. What did that? But like trying to explain what that is impossible. It seems like.
Yeah, it's like it almost makes. And then to go back to that question of like, does Jesus have a pre-fall sin nature, or lack thereof? I guess is what most people would be thinking. It's like, well, I'm not even convinced that Adam and Eve were necessarily, completely free of a sinful nature, even pre-fall. And then that begs a whole bunch of questions. Like, okay, so then what does that mean? What does the fall do? I think that death does enter in because of the fall, because before it had actually been, enacted upon, then there's no death and there's no separation from God. And I do also think that Adam and Eve were not, enslaved to sin.
So you think they had you think they? I see. I would argue that in some way they did not have that. In the concupiscence or whatever is more like kind of like what it means to be born a sinner, if that's even makes sense to say that in some sort of sense. I mean, to me, it's like a propensity to sin starts to be passed along nature and nurture after the fall. And then the question is, well, so then what made them fall? Well, I would say it's not. I'd say those kinds of decisions are like self-generated from your own decisions and your own choices, something like that. But then it's like you find a reason why they're innocent or guilty either way. But it seems otherwise, it seems like you're saying like God made it so that they were going to sin, and I can't go there.
Well, think about this, because this is actually what caused me to start thinking about it. Ask yourself this question: if when we get to heaven, let's play a hypothetical game, a thought experiment, right? Let's say the serpent had access to heaven. This is not going to really happen, but let's just to play a hypothetical, right? And let's say he walks up to regenerate, redeemed, resurrected Jamie and says, Mr. Russell, hath God said, do you believe at that time you would have that there would even be a possibility that you could succumb to his deceptions? Or
No.
will we be regenerate to such an extent? He just said, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly what I believe as well. I think we'll be regenerate to such an extent that even if he did come up and try to deceive us, we could still be confident. No, God has said this, that, and the third. Right?
I like, for me, that is like that. The reason there's evil in the world is because that can't happen when it's all said and done. That's how I look at theodicy. Like, I literally think that is why there's evil, that God has allowed evil to make it so that that circumstance will not happen. Free will intact, if you will.
So now think about that. So if that's true, if it's true that the serpent could walk up to heavenly Jamie and say, hath God said, and heavenly Jamie would tell him, kick rocks, buddy, because God hath said, right? What does that mean for Adam?
I'd be like, look at the books. The books have been opened, my son.
Right?
Flee thee away.
Well, so what does that mean for Adam and Eve then, right? Because they did fall into that deception. So what I'm trying to get at is like, it seems like there's something.
God set it up. God set it up.
Well, and I actually, I'll be honest, this bullet is a lot easier for me to bite as a Calvinist than it might be for a non-Calvinist. And it's no surprise to me that the two guys I mentioned as having had this idea before, Theodore Beza and R.C. Sproul, are both Calvinists. But it is a weird, because it's almost like by saying that, you're conceding that there was still, it's not the same as us, but in some sense, in some capacity, there was something deficient about Adam and Eve before the fall that is not going to be deficient about us and Adam and Eve included, of course, after the resurrection. And I think that very thing is concupiscence. I think that they had not sinned. Death had not set in. They were not bound by sin and to such an extent that they were unable to prevent themselves. But I think there was still that, that little voice in the back of their head that said, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. It'll be fun. You know what I mean?
I would say that's influence, though, not causal. But I think a lot of early church fathers wrote about some of this stuff, like, or the Jews even, if I recall, like regarding the innocence of Adam and Eve. They were morally culpable, yet some have said like they would have eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil just in the due season or whatever, but they were too young. But they were still morally culpable. But they were somewhat ignorant. And so a lot of people actually didn't think that's not that they would never eat from the knowledge of good and evil, but that it wasn't time for them yet. And then they disobeyed wrongfully because they didn't have to. So, but then the question is, well, would God know what they were going to do? I think we should just leave that part of mystery, like, and then ask the question of the text. What does it seem to be saying regarding like, does it want us to think God set them up? I would say it seems not. So I want to say, I'm going to keep that a mystery because I think God says disobedience is wrong and brings bad things, but he lets it happen. And then I'm going to say, yeah, I think he probably knew it was going to happen, but I'm not going to say he wanted them. I mean, that's like Mormonism. It's like God, like what the Mormons say about that. It's weird. I don't know. Your thoughts, Yahoo? You want to come and get on this? What's your thoughts on that? Did God want him to fall or not? What's up with that?
No, I definitely ponder on that. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there's only one other thing in Scripture that I can think of that is the knowledge of good and evil, and that's the law or the Torah. So I guess the difference between like after them eating the fruit would be something to the effect of like they know better, and it wouldn't be like an ignorance thing. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. Like, so I've thought a lot of people like kind of imagine, even if it is allegorical in some sense, like I don't think the fruit like made them understand good and evil and that they didn't understand before, other than the fact that God said don't eat it. And then when they went their own way, like not obediently, by lack of faith, they said, I'm going to go my own way against God. That literally just by God could have said, don't press the red button. And there's like 5 buttons, one of them's red. He's like, God's like, that's the knowledge of good and evil, or don't walk in that, section of the garden. It's the section of knowledge of good and evil. And just by God saying the command to not do it and then them doing it, it literally makes it the knowledge of disobedience, experiential knowledge, like.
Okay, I get what you're saying. Yeah, that's definitely a more simple way to understand it. So probably more correct. But yeah, I like it.
I mean, what do you think, CJ? Do you think it was like, most people seem to allegorize it as like this idea of it's like it could be literal and then also like more to it than that we're just not told, where it's like it has to do with just following God's commands or whatever. How do you think about that? Is that good enough for them just to disobey a command?
The whole thing is very, very odd to me because there's so many questions. Like we just had that question we were just talking about like concupiscence, right? Which is it's like I don't think that it would even be possible for them to fall unless they were concupiscent in some sense. It's like if you don't have a propensity to sin, then you just wouldn't, which is why we won't in heaven, because we won't have that. You know what I mean? But then there's also questions of like the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Yahoo just pointed out, well, the only other thing I even know of that does that is Torah. But we know Torah is good. But the tree of knowledge of
God's instructions.
Good. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's another thing that's super weird.
If you put it in like the Acts 15 sort of thing, it'd be like dumping it all on them at once rather than like slowly integrating them into it. I don't know. That's my perspective, I guess.
Yeah. That's what I was suggesting and what I was trying to suggest.
And what if it was that like man in his pre-fall state, since he didn't have knowledge of good and evil, could, like when a baby does something that we would consider, quote, evil, like maybe a baby. I guess not a baby, but a toddler, because babies are pretty useless. They can't do much of anything.
I don't
Right.
think. I think they were more culpable than that. I want to say they didn't have to do it, and God, because the problem is God said not to do it, and if you say like He wants them to do it, then He's like lying. Don't you think?
See, but well, this is my question with this though. Is like, what questions? There's, like I said, there's so many. What does it mean if it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Then does that mean they didn't have knowledge of good and evil beforehand? That seems like what the text is saying. But then also they know that eating of it is bad, so that can't be 100% right. It's like I don't know.
It's teaching like they knew they depended on God, and so I think this is like a very powerful teaching about what it means to like righteousness by faith. It's like it's all starts with faith is mental decision, right? And then but then when you act outside of faith, you disobey God. You go your own way. It's like teaching what happens when you don't have faith in God, like in a pure sense. Like there is no faith in God without like obedience, is my opinion. Like in some sense, like it starts like a small seed, but that's like it all went wrong right there for them. She just decided like I don't believe God, and that's what sin is. It's faithlessness. It's not believing God.
Yeah, and I even agree with that. But that's still to a limited in a limited sense, knowledge of good and evil. You know what I mean? And then there's even a further question beyond that, which is like, and now granted, this is somewhat easy for me to just rest in being reformed, and perhaps it's not as easy for you guys to rest in being not reformed, but I often find it very strange, God is all knowing. At least that's what we affirm, right? And he's also the creator, and without him was not anything made that was made. And he's also the person who put everything where it was supposed to be, and he also didn't do anything when it all started to go haywire. You know what I mean? And it's like so God created the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then he put it in the garden, and then he created Adam and Eve, and he knew exactly what they were going to do if he created them as he created them, but he created them that way anyways. And then he put them in the same garden, and he made sure they had access to that tree. And then he created a serpent and put that serpent in the same garden. And then when it all went the way he already knew it was going to go, he didn't do anything about it. You know what I mean? And it's like, so how do we even, and this is part of the reason I didn't want to turn this into Calvinism, sorry, but I guess I have to. I don't even know what it means to say God didn't determine that in some sense, because it's like he set up all the puzzle pieces exactly how it would need to go in order for us to be where we are now. And it's not like he just was sitting up there having himself, and I know you guys don't believe this, but I'm just going to have fun with it a little bit. It's not like he's sitting up there going, oh my God, Eve, don't do it. I wish I could do something about it. I wish it was God or something. You know what I mean? Like he knows. He's fully aware. He's so like, what does that mean? What does that entail? I think it entails that there's some kind of a divine plan going on that's been going on since the beginning. But like how easy would it have been to just not create the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or to put it somewhere else, or to not give the serpent access to you know what I mean? Like, and so many other questions I have. The point I'm even getting at here is the Garden of Eden is such a bizarre, and I don't mean bizarre in the sense of like it's weird, but bizarre in the sense of like I have so many questions. Event in biblical history. Like it does seem like God is saying, don't do this. And yet it also seems like he takes all the steps necessary to ensure that they do that. And so it's like, why? What is that? There's got to be some underlying meaning behind that. It can't just be as simple as, God fibbing, because God doesn't fib. And it's funny too is I'll bring this up even with other Calvinists, and they start thinking, I think you're asking questions that are a little bit too, mouthiest, and it's like, well, you can say that, but you haven't actually answered the question. You know what I mean? Anyways, I don't know. I'm ranting. Seems like
I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna say, be a Calvinist. That's fine. I would just say if it starts making you think like God really wants people to sin, like that's a problem. Like in my opinion, like that's my opinion on it. So like, I'm gonna take the text for what it seems to be saying. It's like God saying you shouldn't do that, and I can't help but think. So let's put it this way. For an example, is an analogy, I would say something like this. Like, so let's say I set two people up for a date, and then they end up killing each other, and I thought they were going to be a great and now imagine that the whole incident was videotaped, and then somebody traveled back in time and handed me the videotape before I set them up. Is it still my fault that they killed each other? Even though, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, but God knew before, and I know, but we don't really know how God knows anything. It doesn't even say that he knew that they were going to fall per se. Like, it doesn't say that explicitly anyway. I mean, we can deduce that. And I think you can show that from different things in the text that God like wasn't taken by surprise, right? And that God's all knowing and everything. But then the thing is, how does the story present it? It doesn't present it that God set it up for them to fall. The narrative is told like God doesn't want them to eat the knowledge of the tree. So I think we should take that, and then anything else should be left in the mystery zone, because the text doesn't say like, oh, by the way, God really wanted them to actually do it. It says he didn't want them to eat the tree. So I'm going to take that as my primary. And then yes, I have to admit that it seems like God knew they were going to do it, but I want to take the way it, I guess I'm saying I'd rather keep the mystery there, and then because that's how it's presented, I guess, on the explicit level or something. Because then you're like questioning if God means what he says. That seems probably, like Yahoo, you can speak. Back me up, Yahoo.
I guess I look at it like maybe a computer programmer, like, because I differ from CJ obviously, because I think we have free will, and so if he's going to create something with free will so that he can get to a free will love that isn't like kidnapping or Stockholm syndrome, or I don't know, something along those lines. Like, he knows exactly what's going to happen, and if there was another way to create a being that has free will and is able to love in full capacity, he probably would have done it another way. So I think he did it this way because it had to be this way, and then him knowing everything that was going to happen, he just put those in place. Like if I'm going to have a fire on my property, I know that I have to go around and like rake everything around the fire so I don't catch the yard on fire, and then I might want to like put some water out. Like there's preparation steps that I need to do because I know that like accidents can happen, or whatever. I don't know, like something to that effect, I guess. And it just more so shows how all-knowing and all-powerful he is, because even with free will, like nothing still surprises him, I guess.
Yeah, Janet's saying, I was thinking that too, Janet. It's like, yeah, I should have. See, I'm not like God. I didn't have good planning, and then the underbrush caught on fire, and my whole yard was on fire. So yeah, so to me, it seems like if you just think about like the overarching narrative, like throughout like the Old Testament, right, with Israel, and it's like God's like constantly being long suffering and putting up with stuff, and then here and there he has to like do something really serious, and he gives warnings and judgments, and then like they disobey, like the Babel, the flood, and then Babel, he has to separate them, and then he slowly calls back Abraham and calls his people out of Egypt, and like they're disobeying and they have to stay in the wilderness, and then it's like, you know what I mean? Like God's long suffering, putting up with stuff, like trying to work. So it's like that has a feel. That narrative has a feel like God's not determining everything in a certain sense, right? Like to me, I mean, I'll let you. I want to hear what you have to say, CJ. But there does seem to be this narrative that like seems like you might miss if you're too deterministic. Like there seems to be this theme in the narrative where God's like putting up with people what they do, right? And like he's in charge and he's going to deal with it how he deals with it, and he puts judgments on it. But it's like seems like he's like patiently long suffering. Like I'm not sure exactly what that even means if he's determining everything. Like what would you say to that?
Well, I first off, I guess I would just kind of disagree, because I think that to me it seems like the narrative is perfectly consistent with a determinist view, if that determinist view is compatibilistic, which is to say that if it takes into account Adam and Eve operating freely, at least in some capacity. I would defer from the libertarian in saying, I don't think free will necessarily is undetermined, right? So I want to affirm that both are true, and so if that is taken into account, then I think that I could affirm the narrative as it develops, as well as the questions that arise at the same time. But I think that one of the interesting things from my perspective is, we had Yahoo here, and he's saying that, well, this is the way that it had to be done in order for God to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. And the interesting thing is I completely agree with that. But I think that when you boil it all down to the nuts and bolts, that is Calvinism. It's like, okay, God does know all this, and he can do it any other way, but he wants to accomplish something very specific. He wants loving relationships with his creatures. He wants to glorify himself. He wants to work to the good of those who are called according to his purpose. He wants to manifest his attributes: judge, creator, redeemer, etc. And so to best accomplish that, he does what he writes the story that, that, I guess I'm being redundant, but that best accomplishes that. And he could have done it a different way if he wanted to, but instead he deliberately enacted for it to be the way that it is here, so that these things could end up, going according to plan.
Do you think our ability to, do you think our cognitive capacity to consider options and plan trajectories flows from the ability that God has to choose to create or not?
Not necessarily. I think that there's an extent to which, one could say that, perhaps, well, even, I guess, no, even what I was about to say would be no, because dogs make decisions. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in the room with a dog before, of even moderate intelligence, but you can see them thinking through a decision and deciding, do I want to do that, or do I want to do something else, right? So
Dogs will definitely do that.
yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah,
so,
but we don't consider they're acting like rape and murder though either.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that is true, but that's more because they don't have the knowledge of morality that we do. They're not moral beings. They're sort of very, very lightly moral beings, in so much as that they know what their human said, and so, like, a dog can be aware that he's not supposed to take a certain treat, even if the human is not in the room. And they actually have video cameras, watching dogs, and the dog will take, like, a treat off of the counter or something like that, and then he knows he's going to be in trouble, so he goes back to where the treats are, and he puts a new treat on the counter so he doesn't get caught. You know what I mean? So they're moral creatures to a limited extent, but it's not. It's all centered around, that's what my person thinks. It's not centered around what's actually right or wrong, right? They don't think of it as moral duties or anything like that. They think of it more as like a system of do's and don'ts, like rules.
Actually, Jamie could probably answer this question better than anyone, being somebody who works with clay. But I'm just assuming that, you know, every once in a while you just get a bad lump of clay. It's not like you planned for that lump of clay to be bad. It just turned out that way. You know, maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe that, you know, like we can take it back even further and say that, well, God is the one that made the clay, and you know, I don't know. But anyways, I'm just trying to think about it in like a layman's perspective of if you know you were one of those guys that worked with clay. You know, give us your perspective, Jamie.
Well, the problem is with God's knowledge. I would just say the text doesn't tell us that, like, it doesn't actually say like outright explicitly like that he knows how they're going to respond. It's like it seems like God's reacting like you were just describing. Like, well, I don't think Romans 9 is saying that God literally formed them from the womb and molded them along their whole life to be evil so he could destroy them. I think that text is saying something like he's the creator and he's in charge and he's responsible and he's because he's who he is and don't question his moral purposes or whatever. But so like I don't know if you heard my thing about Pharaoh or whatever. I just did a little like my own thoughts about it. And like, I think the whole thing, like who did God harden Pharaoh's heart is kind of stupid. Like it's not really about whether or not God like causally made him harden his heart. It's that God knew how he would react. I think that's what the story's saying. So like that. And I've asked you this before, CJ, like, so I think we said we'd talk about it again. So I'm going to say it like this, like, did God determine Pharaoh? Yeah. He knew exactly how he'd react, and he acted according. God sent Moses to do certain things to get but like that's not even that hard to explain. Like I could have, and I give this example. I think Yahoo heard me talk about this earlier. I'll just give it again really quick. But it's like if you were like your ex-girlfriend was Biden's niece's cousin or something, right? And so you dated her for a long time. And so let's say like, some guy from West Virginia lives in the mountains or whatever, spits tobacco. He's the sheriff or the mayor of the town or whatever. And he sends you, because you were dated the daughter, cousin of, the president. And he says, I want you to go into the White House and tell Biden that he's going to immediately remove all liberal policies and laws from the national books or whatever. I want you to go tell him that. So you get in there and then you say that, like, is that like, say you have more authority than that or whatever. I'm just saying, like, he's gonna be like, whatever, dude. Like, and then you like do miracles or something, and he's like, he gets pressured into it because he's, he sees some sort of like flash of power or like whatever, like, and Moses had some clout or whatever in the court of Egypt. But my point is just that, like, and then God knew how he's going to respond, but like anybody would have known, like, yeah, I'm going to give up my slaves. Yeah, right. I'm God of this land, or half God or whatever. So it's like hardening his heart was just like, look, dude, when I was dating my girlfriend, I knew how to push her buttons, dude, like to get her going and get her pissed off. And so, like, why shouldn't we think of it like that? Like, now if every time I start talking to somebody who doesn't like me and I say the things that irritate them, is that me causing them to be upset? Like, is that determining that they're upset? Like, in a sense, yes. Like, I know exactly what I'm doing. Does that mean that person doesn't have free will? No. Like, what's the difference between God determining it in that sense and some other sense? That's actually seems like more impressive. Like, if God has to like actively set it up so that Pharaoh is ornery or whatever, for him to get his will to be sovereign, that doesn't seem as impressive as God just like, men scheme all the time and God laughs at them, not because he made them scheme, but because he can easily outsmart them or whatever, right? Is that a problem? I mean, that seems like almost more like even if we have free will, like God, you could say like we have free will and God knows exactly what we're going to do. Because if you know somebody really well, you can like predict what they're going to do. You can even manipulate them. There's been like tests for that, right? So like God doesn't even need to determine anything. He can just see how we are. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Is that a problem? I mean, there's things you could bring up that would be like a problem. Like God's not in control, but he could absolutely be in control. Like it might as well be determined. You know what I mean? You get what I'm saying? I don't know. Go ahead and critique it or whatever. I don't care.
Well, the biggest problem for me in that particular line of reasoning is that I just don't really see the difference. It's like if I deliberately provoke somebody to get the response that I know they're going to give, like if that's how you choose to conceive of it, I guess that's fine. But I don't see how that is any morally superior to just claiming determinism. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Especially when one
that's what I
considers.
was getting at too. Just to be clear, I want to make it clear. Like I'm saying, might as well be determinism.
Yeah,
Because it pretty much
exactly.
is.
Right? It's like.
I'm just saying, I'm
well,
trying to like get God off the hook though for like forming, like causing every little sin we do. Like that seems like we can't go there.
Yeah, and the thing for me that I think like makes this a non-issue, so to speak. So consider this, right? So if let's pretend I was a king, okay, and we were living back in 400s BC, and let's say we're Israelites, so I'm the king of Israel, and I say, Jamie, I demand that I think you are the most faithful servant, but I want to prove it. So I demand of you to sacrifice your son to Yehovah to demonstrate for me that you really are the most faithful servant in the kingdom, right? I think we would all agree that that would be a sin for me to demand that of you. That would be a sin, right? First off, human sacrifice is not okay, much less child sacrifice. Secondly, it's not okay to give a unclean sacrifice to Yehovah, right? Thirdly, we could just say that I'm overstepping my authority as an earthly king. But God did exactly that, and it's not sin when He did it. Now, is that special pleading, or is it just the case that God does legitimately have the authority to do things that would be sinful for us to do? Like, is there enough separation between Him and His
Okay, well
creation?
let me. Oh, here's a hypothetical. Okay,
Disagree.
if say you're hiding Jews in the floorboards and it's getting late and you hear a knock at the door and you turn to open the door and standing between you and the door appears the risen Christ, who's gone back in time into the time period of the war, and the door's knocking and you think, oh dear, could this be the Nazis? You turn and Jesus is standing between you and the door. Time goes pause and you ask him, that's the Nazis, isn't it? Looking for Jews. And he says, yes, it absolutely is. The SS knocking at your door. And then you say, Jesus, should I lie and say I don't have any Jews in here? And of course, Jesus, thinking murder is terrible, what would he say? What would Jesus tell you to do?
I think
If
he'd
you
say
asked
yes.
him,
We have the examples of the handmaids in Exodus who lied to Pharaoh, so I think he'd say yes. You should lie to them.
is that a sin?
Well, kind of. If morality is truly objective, then yeah. But unfortunately, being in a fallen world, you can have two bad options, right?
Where
And
did he
one
go? Is he
option.
coming back? You better come back, boy.
So
Yeah, I'm torn with the language. I want to say it's not a sin, but I absolutely believe in objective morality. I would say that's the problem with sinning. Like once you have a sin in the world, it's like that's like technically like on the books that's a sin, but like it's kind of like the Sabbath thing. It's like there's like it's like, does that make it non-objective or whatever? Because you're not supposed to work. Like that's where they started going wrong, I think, right? Is like not acknowledging that there's like circumstances where weightier measures of the law come to play, and it's actually a good thing to lessen
it's the
evil.
nature of a fallen world, right? Like if you are, I mean, one of my favorite examples is killing somebody, right? I don't think that in a perfect world, I don't think that killing somebody would ever happen, which means to some extent, there's no such thing as righteous killing, to some extent.
Exactly.
But the Bible talks about righteous killing, execution of criminals, fighting in wartime, self-defense. So it's like, so now you have a quandary. Are those things not sinful in any capacity whatsoever? Or is the fact that we live in a fallen world causing us to have to choose between bad options and worse options? I think it's the latter.
It's kind of like sins of ignorance, right? Like, does God judge people the same for? No, there's this principle where like you're judged according to the light you have, and so to me that let's analyze that concept, because if that's the case, that seems to that almost seems like a problem for determinism, if you get what I'm saying. Like, think about that. Like if everything's set, it just is what God sets it up to be on some like really minute what's the right word? Like on every level of existence, it's just God's decision. It seems like this idea of it kind of undermines like the idea of guilt, having different levels of guilt, like according to your knowledge. Like, why would that even matter if it's all just set, kind of like dominoes falling? You know what I mean? Like how it's supposed to be. It seems like no matter what you have to say, even if you're a determinist, you have to say like, God's teaching something by making it seem like, we should punish criminals who are like didn't have any extenuating circumstances putting pressure on them, right? Like if you have if it turns out like, okay, I'll give this example. Like if a guy walks up and like kills your wife, and then you find out he's like on a drug induced binge, or let's just say he's totally straight faced psychopath, just out having jollies, like murdering people, and then that's one version of the story. Like, and then there's that same guy, like then let's say story number 2, the same person, only you find out somebody tied him up and tied up his family, and they're torturing his family back at the house and said, you have to go kill this person, or we're gonna keep murdering your family or torturing your family, and then kill them eventually after a week of torture. And he's like pressured into it, right? Like that guy's not as guilty, for murder. Don't you think?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, I would argue, given the situations that I had listed earlier, like when an executioner executes a criminal who's committed a heinous act, if God does hold that to anyone's account, paradoxically, I think it would be the criminal's. Like, I think the criminal would have his own death upon his own head because he's the one who forced the situation to begin with.
If you guys want to join the conversation, I put the link in there. If you want to join, you can. Any thoughts, buddy? We can go wherever you guys want. I'm getting kind of tired, but you want to bring some? There's some other stuff I wanted to bring up to you, but I think I'm too tired. I was going to ask you about the. I was thinking about going to. You guys want to keep talking about this, or do you want to look at a Bible verse? I was going to bring up Galatians because I want to point something out I noticed.
I'm not tied to this at all. We kind of got here because of other non-related things, and I didn't even mean to turn this into a Calvinism stream, so I do apologize if that.
I love talking about this.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics too. I mean, recently, it's been a combination of talking against these free grace guys and then the abrogationists, which is what I've taken to calling them now because they don't like the term neonomian. So I've gone with abrogationist. I know. Because they believe the law of Moses is abrogated, right? So
I'm torn, dude. I'm torn on like
Paul says
how did it try to explain it? I don't even know how to explain it anymore. I just think the distinction thing is like I see both sides of it. I would just like sometimes it's pragmatic, like how people just can't hear what you're saying, and like, but like I know what they're thinking the whole time when you're saying what you're saying. They're thinking about Galatians, like Galatians 3 or whatever,
I think
That-
I got to be honest with you. After my conversations with Kevin and Paul,
Uh-huh.
and I even look, I love Kevin. Like I consider him a friend and a brother in Christ for that matter. I don't think he's unsaved, but going over Romans 7 5 times with him, and he just refuses.
No, people the way they won't. They
Yeah,
can't.
he just won't do it. He absolutely will not do it. And is that because Kevin's stupid? No, I don't think so. In fact, I know for a fact that Kevin is not stupid because I've had plenty of conversations.
I liked what he was saying there in Paul's stream with Kelvy. He was saying the right. I was like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So he clearly has good doctrine. He's not an idiot. But he cannot. Well, I'm not prepared to say the law of mind is the law of God. Like, but Paul literally said, "With my mind, I serve the law of God." Like, yeah, so the law of the mind has to be the law of God. Well, no, but this Bible doesn't say that. Yes, it literally does. Like
CJ,
word for word.
You got to see this. I was reading today in my reading. I found this. Let's see if I can find it. Where was it? Maybe it was 1 Corinthians, and I want to say somewhere around here. It's in parentheses, but he's like, what does he say? Shoot, I hope I can find it. Give me a second. It literally says something about not being under the law. Then it says, but not, or he's like, where's that verse where he says, I'm like a Jew to the Jew, and to the lawless, I'm lawless.
1 Corinthians 9:20.
9, it was 9. Okay.
Which, by the way, that I have an interesting thing to comment on that verse as well, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, just that it literally, like, if you read it carefully, he says, which one was it? 2 Corinthians?
1 Corinthians 9.
Oh, I have it backwards. Whoops. Okay. All right. I'm tired. Okay.
You're good.
I knew it was right around there. Okay, let's see. Okay.
Then go to verse 20.
Verse 21. Yeah, verse 21. To them that, so I'll start here up here. For though I be free from all, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. He's washing old ladies' feet. And unto the Jews I became a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law. By the way, that's a clue right there. What under the law means. The Jew meaning those who aren't accepting Messiah, that are of his brethren. And so he's telling you right here, what does it mean? It means under the law means they don't have the atonement they don't believe in the atonement. He goes on to say that, by the way. But this verse right here proves it. It proves what under the law means if you think it logically through. He's talking about his brethren that don't believe in Messiah, that he's trying to gain to Christ. They're under the law. I guess maybe people get out of it some weird way. To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain. So he's talking about himself there, I think. I don't know. How do you take that? To me, though, but he's saying, look, in case you misunderstand me, I'm not saying we're without law. I'm saying not without God's law, but I'm under the law to Christ. He doesn't say the law of Christ. He says under the law, meaning that law, which is the law of God that he just said, but with Christ, essentially, is how I take it. What do you think?
Well, so there's a couple things. First off, I think I agree with you if I'm understanding correctly. One thing I thought was particularly interesting about this verse is how he clarifies. He's like, not that I am not under any law to God, almost as if to say, hey, abrogationists in the year 2023, that's
Exactly.
not how you should interpret this.
He doesn't say he's under the law. He avoids that language because it's like he knows what he said or what it means. But he's saying, look, this is basically saying he's not under the law. But look, that doesn't mean I'm without the law of God.
Exactly.
I'm under the law of God through Christ. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, 100%. Right. So it's like the exact verse that people want to use here is contradicting them, because he's saying, no, I do have law to God, actually. It's just that I'm not under the law, unless you want to say under it through Christ, in which case Christ has taken my penalty. But the other thing I thought was very interesting about this is, So Galatians 3:24 says that the law was his taskmaster to bring us to Christ, right? And Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 9 here says that that the those who are under the law are the Jews, right? Now, I think that under the law does more refer to the curse of the law, and so I think it does have an application to Gentiles also. So I'm not 100% sure how I want to think this argument through, but one of the things that's starting to bud in my little head is if under the law refers to being morally obligated to obey the law, and the Gentiles are referred to as those who are not under the law, then in what way is the law a schoolmaster to Gentiles? Because they were never obligated to obey it to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I'm always trying to say when I say, yeah, what year did you graduate? Because they'll say that to me. They'll be like, the law's for the Jews only. And then when in other contexts, the same person will say, I'm not under the law. That was like a schoolmaster for us. Like they're talking about themselves like they're under this covenant thing. And I'm like, no, but you argue that that's not even for you. And you're right if you understand what that means, though. Because it's like, look, he's talking about the Jews being under the Mosaic covenant. And that had stipulations, which were obedience, which they broke. But I think that doesn't mean the moral demands, like God still, the people can still sin without the law in the sense that they know what's right. But now that Christ has come and revealed that and brought God's ways to the nation, so to speak, right? Properly understood. And then now that Mosaic covenant has been ratified and they were an example for the world, right? They had special stipulations. I don't think because God was setting it up for like the idea that like it is about love, because that's what God's law is. But I think some of those things were just for the Jews, obviously, right? Like in the sense that as an example for the rest of the world, like you need God's provision for sin. Like he has to do it because Eve said, I'm not going to go your way. And God's calling you back, not because he wants you to just obey what he says, period. That's it. He wants you to obey, period, no matter what, because he loves you, actually like wants you to freely do it, to see his ways, like by choice, want to do that. And he really wants a family. And like he has, I'm going to go on a side trail. Sorry. So yeah, I think it's not a problem. The world's still convicted of sin because of the example of the Israelites, and the Mosaic covenant is ratified, I'm going to say. But the question is, what passes through that? I would say, obviously, all the moral demands, which are more than the 10 Commandments. But, we don't have to do animal sacrifices, I think. And that was never intended for everybody. But, yeah, under the law does mean what you're saying, like we've talked about. I just think it does have ties to this Mosaic covenant, which has been ratified. But that has like this. So it's like Christ's death does just ratify that covenant, like in context, like immediate context of what he's doing when he's on earth, but like that brings it to the whole world who are morally culpable to, the moral demands of what it means, God's character or whatever, something like that. I don't know. I'm kind of floundering here.
No, I get what you're saying though. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something that these guys really need to think about clearly and try to deal with, because, and by the way, while we're on this note, speaking of 1 Corinthians, and I have to rant here a little bit. I'm sorry. So every time that we get to a point where this was happening when I was talking with Kevin, every time we would get to a point where he didn't have any more wiggle room, he would say, yeah, but God never convicts me to not eat shellfish. And it's like, okay, just throw that argument away for a minute, because it is a total red herring. You're basically saying, yeah, okay, maybe I don't have an answer for this argument, but what about the shellfish? And it's like, well, what about the shellfish? What if I don't even have an answer for you about the shellfish? Does that make my argument that I just made you invalid, even though it has nothing to do with shellfish? You know what I mean? Which, by the way, they're disgusting anyways. You shouldn't eat shrimp. It's gross.
And by the way, maybe God's trying to convict you right now by CJ showing you this. That's why we have the Word of God. He didn't just say we have the Spirit and whatever we think seems right, because we're, that seems, and I'm not accusing him of this, but it's like, I don't think people realize that when they call people calling for what God calls good and calling evil what God calls evil, and they get all mad and try to say you're self-righteous. Like I would be careful with that. Like you're basically saying you're righteous, like without that. Like that's your self righteousness. Like I'm just saying what I think God wants. Like there's nothing like I have good intentions and it's what God says. I don't know what else I can do. And people get all pissy like, "Oh, are you saying you're better than me?" sort of thing. And I'm going, "Dude, I think you're missing it, man." Yeah, by the way, don't eat stuff. I mean, I would say what God calls food is probably for a reason. And like, if it eats poop for a living, like it literally eats poop for a living, you might not want to eat that.
Yeah, and go ahead.
I have a video on the food laws in the New Testament if anyone's brave enough.
I think I might be. I already don't eat shrimp, so it'll be pretty easy for me. In fact, the only non-kosher food that I do eat is pork, which maybe I shouldn't, but I'll admit I've been eating it for my entire life, so it's weird to think of pork as not food.
Hi, Mom.
Hi, how are
Hugs
you?
and kisses. How are you doing?
Hugs and kisses to everybody.
It's good to hear your voice. You're a little quiet. Let me see if I can turn you up a little bit.
Okay,
Is that Janet?
it's Janet.
Hi, I've never actually talked to you before. Shalom.
Yeah, shalom.
Yeah, I can't turn it up, but I can hear you a little bit. There you are. I hear you.
I'll try to yell at you. So yeah, not to eat poop. I'm trying to convince the Doberman not to do that. So she needs to eat more clean. And I tell her she's better than that, but it's not working out. Any advice? Oh, I don't hear you. Hello?
Yahoo. I thought you had divided. I hear you.
I lost you. Okay. Yeah, as far as the law goes, we have the one side that only wants to accept Paul, and then we have our friends that reject Paul. And for me, if I would eliminate, the writings of Paul, I would still see in the rest of the Bible instructions that are to be obeyed and not ignored. Or if I take out the words of Jesus and the four Gospels and just read Paul, I still have the same doctrine that I hold, that instructions in the law is good and to be obeyed even in 2023. So that's my frustration.
I completely agree with that, and that's one of the things that amazes me is people. You have these two people using Paul. You have the abrogationists who say Paul is abrogating the law, and then you have the guys who don't like Paul, and they're saying Paul is abrogating the law,
Right.
but they don't abrogate it. And then, I look at like Romans chapter 7. As an example, and it's not the only example, or Romans chapter 6 or Romans chapter 8, or like the entire book of Romans for that matter, or Hebrews, or Corinthians, especially First Corinthians. And it's like, I don't see what you guys are talking about. This man, to me, seems like he's very pro law. He now in a Christian context, certainly, but like he talks about like First Corinthians. I have this argument with Kevin right now where Kevin keeps saying, well, we don't have to keep a Passover as Christians. And I'm saying, yeah, actually, not only do you have to keep a Passover, but it's actually amplified now. If you're not keeping the Passover, which is to say Jesus Christ, you're not a Christian.
Yeah, I did hear that one. That was really a good stream. And yeah, what about Timothy? 1st and 2nd Timothy. Oh, well, of course, parts of Peter are just really strong at pushing for the instructions. Or I often say, just read a proverb a day, and maybe you'll feel different about the importance of hearing and embracing and following the instructions. If not, you hate life and you love death.
Amen. 100% right.
Yeah, I saw your post. I'm gonna throw up put your link in the chat there, buddy. Yahoo.
Did someone forget to mute on the YouTube side? I'm hearing echoes, and mine is muted.
It's CJ's. He's a party animal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, there's a TV on in the
Oh,
background.
it's a TV. Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't. Okay.
What do you want me to post?
Oh, that video you're talking about. I can do it too. In a second.
Yeah, I'm on my phone, or it would be really easy for me to do it.
Yeah, I'll do it in a second. I was
All
going
right.
to show you guys something. When somebody goes through the Galatians, they'll skip to 3 and 2, and he says, it sounds really like, for as many as of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law. I think the work of the law are actually like it's in a sense, it's saying like the Mosaic covenant. And so that's being contrasted with those that aren't accepting the new covenant in the Messiah. And so he's saying like doing all the things under that Christ is, the end of, but that's remains to be, worked out. But let me just, like, if you keep reading it, but that no man is justified by the law. It's like this false dichotomy where it's like, if you're not justified by the law, you don't keep the commandments. That's just ridiculous. It's actually really scary if you think about it. But Christ has redeemed us. They hear the curse of the law and they think the law is a curse, right? The blessing of Abraham has come through faith in contrast to the law, which is a curse and which is death, the law of sin and death. They even think that's talking about God's commandments. Before then, serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions. So God's law that defined transgression was added because of transgressions. It was a punishment. God's law of love is a punishment. This is how people read this. We were kept under the law, that mean old bad God that Marcion did away with, And you read, this is how people are reading it essentially, whether they admit it or not. And then you get to Galatians 5, and it's all this language that people misunderstand. And you get to Galatians 5, and he's saying the same sort of thing. For we are the spirit of the hope of righteousness by faith. It's contrasted with you're fallen from grace if you are justified by the law. So the law is bad, obviously, and Jesus saved us from that bad old law. Not, and it's like there's this problem, like it's a cognitive dissonance, I think. That's not what he doesn't mean how people are hearing this. But notice what happens here. He says this, like, look, he says, if you're justified by the law, which nobody is who's advocating for the law, right? You're justified by Christ because you can't. The reason you're not justified by the law is because you're sin. And so the law just condemns you, right? Because one sin and you're condemned or whatever, right? You're fallen from grace. That means no law whatsoever. It's they're against each other. But notice this. Because we got it through the hope of righteousness by faith, in that we trust in God's provision through Christ, which is the foundation of our salvation. That doesn't mean you don't keep the commandments. Because this is where he says, after all that, he says, for in Christ Jesus, circumcision is nothing nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh through love. Okay, yeah, it's all about now faith and love, which is apparently supposed to be a contradiction between keeping the commandments. But then that works all the way to that. Now notice what he says. And so faith working through love. This is my famous thing. When you look at the context, it's even more powerful because in the same sort of spiel, he says that he's talking about the same thing. And he says, circumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments of God. It literally has an emphasis in the Greek. He says that's what matters. He says, so I would assert that faith working through love is the commandments properly understood. And that's what Jesus came to do, to magnify the law, to make it honorable, because they were twisting it and they're misusing it. Jesus tells them in Matthew, if you read it carefully, or maybe it's Luke, he's arguing with the Pharisees. He's saying they're hypocrites. Why? Not because they do the law and they think they're so good because they do the law. They're hypocrites because they don't actually do what the law is saying to do. They don't actually do it. And then he goes on to say, not only does he say, when they're teaching from the word of God, meaning the law, from Moses' seat, do what they say when they're reading the words of God from the book, but don't do as they do. What do? They're hypocrites. What does he say? He says, you have made void the law of God and replaced it with the traditions of men. You've made void the law of God by your tradition. Right. Think about those words. That's not condemning the law. Jesus isn't saying you're bad because you think you're self-righteous for obeying what I said properly understood. He actually says, do what the book says. You're a hypocrite and you're disgusting because you're not listening to what God said. and he tells the people do what they say, and then he chastises them not for keeping the commandments, but for twisting them, not keeping them.
Right. I think his language is heavy because of he's speaking against the ones that are legalistic about the traditions of circumcision and everything. And if Paul was talking to us today in the United States, especially on YouTube, he would not be preaching hard against legalism because we have lawlessness. You know, we have what you see in 2 Timothy 3.
Yes.
And his
I
message
was just looking at that. I'm going to bring it up.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So I just think that this, you know, these, what, I don't know if it's like maybe say 5 verses that the people that are having trouble with Paul, they stress and they don't like the way it's worded, and they think that that it leads people to be, you know, lascivious and stuff. But I think if you remember who he's speaking to at that time, and maybe just, even if you don't like the way he worded it, I mean, we can look at like Joseph. Maybe Joseph sounded a little bit like he was bragging to his brothers about his coat. You know, it's better to have a little bit of trouble with 5 verses than to eliminate all of Paul, because like, and I get along with Ace philosophy. He does acknowledge that Paul has some great verses in there about living holy and godly. So, okay, struggle a little bit with those 5, but don't eliminate all of them, you know?
I know the scholars recognize Paul as like a brilliant mind, and like Romans is probably the greatest work of literary prowess in like this millennium, you know, and it has had more impact on Western culture than any other document, you know, besides the words of Jesus. It's like, he's not an idiot. Scholars recognize that, even the ones that don't believe. Like, to think that Paul was just being contradictory, at least have a theory, like, that doesn't work. Like, he started the church. I mean, he was a big part of starting the church and starting the Christian faith. Like, and like, he has, if you don't have any historical, like, any sort of grasp of the historical, like, development and, you know, of different groups and churches, like, today's claims are not what has been common from the beginning. That people have understood Paul like I'm talking about Paul. Yeah, this is great because this came up in I think Olive and Praise were, I was listening to them for a few minutes, and they brought this up trying to respond to this guy who they thought they were agreeing with, and then they found out he was actually saying something they don't agree with. But know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. Men will be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good.
That's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, this is YouTube. Traitors, heady, high-minded. I mean, it's convicting too of me. I find myself falling into this all the time. The pride and being fierce and unthankful, unholy.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm guilty. Having a form of godliness, but this is the verse they were centering on, but they didn't realize what was all around it. I'm going, you guys, this is a call to holiness. This isn't a call to like OSAS per se, right? It's a call to that you can't lose your salvation. Whether that's true or not isn't the point. My point is that, like, what is the warning? Is the warning, what are they always warning about? False teachers doing, giving you a false liberty, but getting you entangled in sin. It's always about sin and false teaching and not obeying the truth.
Right.
They creep into houses and leave captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts. Wow. Ever learning and never being able to come to the knowledge of the truth. I thought, man, if you just pull up the text, he'd be convicted. Sorry.
Yeah.
Not to be
I
mean.
think of flow charts a lot of times. If you're lovers of God, that means you fear God. If you fear God, in Proverbs, it says you depart from iniquity. You know, so when it says denying the power thereof, they just have that form of godliness. They can state, you know, I believe in Jesus, but the power to overcome the sin is what he's exposing.
That's what I've always, because people will bring that up and they think it means they use it to defend. I've noticed that and I don't want to be like really negative towards people. I would say people like literally think this is defending their view of not a call to holiness. And I'm going, dude, the power that they're denying is the power of God to, the power of his ability to change you. That's how I read it, right?
Right. Same thing for like what we see in Romans 6. And in 1 Corinthians 10:13, we have the power to overcome.
Yeah, what's 1 Corinthians 10:13? That's a good one. I forget what it was.
That is, he won't give you more than you can. That's right. Go bring it up.
You're under the temptation of all what's common to man. He won't tempt you or he won't let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but always provide a way of escape.
The way of escape first. Yeah.
Wow, that should be. I mean, think about that verse. I mean, what that suggests. It's like saying, don't. How do you understand that, CJ? I know I asked you this recently. How do you think about that one? What do you think that's saying exactly? I want to be careful that I don't be sure about that. I still need to look. Tyler Vela said he made a video about it because I was challenging him with this verse, saying like, look, dude, God, like this to me, this verse seems like it's suggesting that there's multiple, like God's saying, look, I'm going to give you a way out. We'll bring back to the Calvinist thing for a second real quick, but I want to hear more from Janet because she's always got a bunch of good verses and good wisdom for us. There has no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with that temptation also make a way to escape that ye may be able to bear it.
Right.
It seems like it's saying God's saying like essentially if you I don't know what the word would be, but it seems like it's saying God can help you out from sinning or whatever. Right.
When like you're tempted. So like when you say that we can not sin and people, call you out saying, how could you say that? Like we have to sin. Well, when I do sin, if you sin, you have in 1 John 1:9, right? You can repent, be forgiven. But according to this, you have the ability to say no to sin. And in Romans 6:14 says the same thing. Sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. Grace gives you the power to not be in bondage to sin.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like he's saying here, like, don't misunderstand. Like, it's through God's power, you could say walking in the Spirit, or through a vital connection or abiding in Christ.
Right.
It's kind of like saying, look, it's not really about free will so much as it is about, look, God's making available such a way that this verse seems to make it say that you can't say I had to sin. Seems like that's what it's saying, something like that. Like God's, and there's all sorts of theological issues potentially with theology here, like, prevenient grace. It's essentially like, seems like it's saying God is making available some sort of power for you to not sin. So that like when you do, you're guilty and you repent if you're a believer, right?
Right. It said, walk in the Spirit, you'll not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Let not sin reign in your body. Put on the new man, put off the old man. Don't give room to don't give place to the devil, right? So we have ways, we have armor, and which one are we going to choose?
Yeah, and I mean, if you don't, I mean, you might like not have fellowship with God, but it's all good, I mean, that's the kind of thing people say. It's like when somebody tries to like sweep it away as being like, oh, I'm just thinking of Charles, like it's just all these categories people throw in the text. It's like, I wonder if they ever actually read it, like just read it for them, like is it a message to you? Like it seems like people aren't reading it at all. They're just using it as a proof text and taking out pieces of it. I mean, if you just read through the text like privately in your quiet time, like I know there would be a lot more agreement. Is
I don't
that
know.
judgmental? Is that judgmental of me?
Well, do you think that doctrine is sort of used like a Xanax or like getting drunk, that doctrine sort of numbs the conscience, like it sort of quiets the conscience when the conscience is saying you need to stop that, but then you tell it these, statements from your doctrine that you're free from the curse and the law is bad and everything, that sort of stills your conscience. Do you think that's something that maybe happens?
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to want to say too much because I feel like a hypocrite. I would just say, but at the same time, I'm just like, there's got to be someone better out there that can show it or whatever. It's so clear to me that people. I don't want to have like a what do they call that? It's like a fraud syndrome or whatever. Like, I feel like I'd be a fraud if I say what I really think. I think there's a lot of people that need God and they don't have God at all. And how do you tell somebody who is sure that they're fine that they might not be fine, and without sounding cruel? I guess I don't know.
Right. Well, but none of us have ever said that we believe in sinless perfection. None of us have said that we, go a day perfect. I know I don't, and I've never heard any of you say that. But there's one thing between just looking for the easy road or to long to obey all the time and wanting to that be your goal, looking unto Jesus so that you can follow him better and analyzing yourself.
Yeah. The thing is, what do you do? Like, I think a lot of these people that I interact with, they're just so easy to get upset with, and I'm a good advocate for it. But at the same time, it's like I don't disagree with them about grace and like the foundation of the faith, right? Like being justified by the merit of Christ. But it's just like when somebody fights the text so blatantly and like it's logically doesn't make sense and the text doesn't, it's like I want to call some of them out because they clearly don't read the text and they I don't know. I'll just stop there talking about people, but
well, there'd be something wrong if you weren't grieved, because there is a grieving of the Holy Spirit when the Spirit of God lives in you.
Yeah, it's like I had good intentions to like analyze one of Bill's videos, but then I found myself like feeling like thinking about circumstances people have and you don't know, but it's like that's why you got to be so careful about how you teach it too, because I know I've made mistakes with what I thought I was saying, and so we got to be humble too, like, but at the same time you want to like stand for what you really see in the text. But if you're overconfident, like people don't seem to have any care about what they're like potentially like brainwashing people with, like this nonsense. It's just like there's just no care to it or whatever. And I'm the same way. Like I joke around all the time or whatever, but it's like
the discouraging thing too is that we know that most of these people, they know the verses that we think is the answer to the problem or the error. They've already heard the verse, and I think you too, most of us here can pretty much expect what their reply is going to be to those verses. They're going to say, that was just to Israel. That was just for that time. That was just discipleship. There's typical answers that deflate the power of that verse.
Oh, I want to say while we're streaming here, CJ, talk me back from the ledge, but I'm going to say this and then now you can advocate why you think maybe this is overstepping my bounds here. But if I hear this argument, like born again means you can't be unborn, therefore OSAS is true. Like if I hear that argument one more time, I'm going to snap. Like that's the stupidest argument I've ever heard. And if anybody says ever again, may God have mercy on their soul.
The abortion.
That is not what that verse means. And like it's like, if that's true, if that's a proper analysis of that verse, then it's like, you're like arguing how people think Nicodemus is saying, I can't be born again. I can't crawl back in my mother's womb. Therefore you can't, I mean, by the same logic, I feel like I could say, well, obviously you can't even be born again because you can't be born twice because you're already born. It's like, I think is what he's saying is like, you need a total renovation of you, you need a spiritual rebirth, has nothing to do with whether or not you can be born again, like a second time is other than to say like, it has to happen from above. It has to be God doing it or whatever, something like that. Or like, he's speaking of like, they're just, what do you think that's saying? Do you think it's a good argument, CJ?
Say that one again.
Is it a good argument? Is that a good argument? Born, like, you must be born again. Therefore, that he's teaching you can't lose your salvation there. I'm not, now forget whether or not that's true or not regarding eternal security, but just, I really think that's a dumb argument, to be honest. Make your case.
Well, I guess I've never used that argument personally in my own cases for eternal security, but I can see the logic behind it. In fact, one thing that I think is interesting is if you look at the standard classical Armenian position on eternal security, they think you can only lose your salvation once, and then at that point you can't ever be saved again. And that's their interpretation of Hebrews 10 and Hebrews 6, which lines up with that idea. It's like the born again process. You can't be unborn. You can die, but you can't be unborn. And that applies just as much to the second as to the first on the Armenian. So I've never used that argument myself, but I think you might be being a little more critical than is necessary.
Well, but if Calvinism is true, then like that fits with it. But if like Calvinism isn't true, to me, that's a dumb argument. Like it fits within Calvinism. Yeah, that's kind of what I'd say. So like, I'm saying like in and of itself, like what is this? His point isn't to say you can't lose your salvation. His point has to do with the condition of the teachers of Israel and the needing a total revamp, and it needs to come down from God, not from the ground up in their own self-righteous, desires or whatever. He's not teaching that you can't lose your salvation. He's teaching about, is what I'm saying. But like, yeah, if Calvinistic framework is true, then that would be a consequence of what's being said there, I would say maybe. But like from a neutral, hyper focused, what his point is, he's not it's kind of like, it's just like with the thing with when he's arguing with Abraham, people think it's a slam dunk about Abraham's alive in heaven. It's like that may or may not be true that Abraham's alive in heaven, but this text doesn't prove that. It's kind of like where I'm going with that. I can see how the mistake gets made in my mind anyways, and I could be wrong. I think it's like a good point of like understanding what the text says and what it doesn't say carefully. That's kind of where I'm going with it, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I can kind of see like why it's annoying, because it's like more of a quip than an argument. Like when Donnie would talk about spiritual abortion.
Yeah.
That's not so much of an argument as much as it is like,
Rhetoric.
trying.
It's propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when I call the free gracers quarter Jews. That is
I do it too. I'm such a hypocrite. Yeah. I mean,
but there is an underlying argument in all three of those examples.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd be a little less critical, but like I said, I've never personally used that argument, and I don't think that I ever would, because it doesn't, even if it's right, it's not going to be particularly convincing. You know what I mean? Like I prefer things like he who began a good work in you will not stop it until the day of Jesus, right? Where it's like, okay, so if it is true that a good work has begun in you, then this text to me seems to be reading like God will accomplish it. And so if you leave, we can assume that the good work was not ever, begun. And, and like I said, one of the things that causes me to have even like a interest in that argument is I remember that Armenian argument. David Paulman is the one who actually first told me about it on the Armenian view. and I've actually checked it since. You know, John Wesley would have taught this, and a couple others. If you ever lose your salvation, you're done. You're like, that's like a reprobate. You cannot be saved at that point on their theology.
There is a sense where if you can lose your salvation, that's kind of true. I can, like, it sounds so like silly, almost like an over hyper reading of that Hebrews text, right? But what it's saying, it seems to me though, is that it's saying it's not so much about whether you're one or done or not. It's just like if you fully have like received Christ and then you do walk away, whether it's hypothetically like impossible or whatever, but it's like saying it's like no matter how you read that text, you have to like not take it directly literally. I would say, like, it seems like it's a warning, but it's like, if you can't lose your salvation, what is it saying? I think it's just like a warning, like, look, once you start coming to the faith, if you turn back, you may never turn back to it, is kind of what it's saying. You know what I mean? Like, that's how I would want to take it, whatever your position is. It's a real warning. I don't think it's saying like like God has a set thing where you're one and done, you know, unless Calvinism's true, like I guess that would be Arminian-ish way of reading it. What do you think, Janet? What is that verse saying?
I think it does speak about your conscience being seared. So if you are seared to the point where, whether you're, you know, in the pits at the time and rebelling or more contemplative at that time, if you can't hear the Father drawing you back, if it's gotten that quiet in your conscience that you can't hear God calling you back, I mean, is that a possibility?
Yeah. It seems to me it wants to say, like, look, if you understand the gospel and you experience the things like the world to come, and you had the Holy Spirit and you understand the gospel, and you know, he gives like 5 different things. I can't remember off the top of my head, but to me, that's like, I don't know how else he could say, whether it's, I would just say it's, if you want to argue it for like a hypothetical thing, that's just like he's giving the extreme example to people who are halfway there that could turn back still or something, maybe argue that way. But yeah, I mean, I've often pondered that it's kind of like, if God, like, if it's true you could leave the faith, which I believe you could, it happens. Right. Like, it's saying, if God took you back through the books of the person's life, each person that like was in a position of being like right with God, where they'd go to heaven if they died or whatever, that sort of thing. But then at some point later, they turned their back on God, and like, you know, presumably God like sent them, you know, things that happened in their life to call them back, and they never did. I mean, there's going to be a point where God can say, that was the point where they were never going to come back, and he took away the Holy Spirit or whatever, right? Like, or he withdrew and kind of let them go like a reprobate. And so something like that seems to me, God would know a point where the person was like, couldn't turn back, although there's all sorts of philosophical problems with that, but that's how I look at it. Like, so maybe that's the case. Like, certain people reach a point in their life where they're never going to believe, essentially, is what I'm saying. Like, isn't that what reprobate means?
If you take that interpretation, some people, so the doctrines surrounding what a reprobate is vary from group to group. Like,
right.
I don't think you should ever treat somebody as though you know they're a reprobate, just to be clear. But there seems to me like there could be a point that we can't tell and we don't know, but God would know, where that's like something where like there is a point where someone reaches that where their conscience is seared, but we should never act like that. We know that's the case with somebody. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I'm not 100. So typically in Calvinist doctrine, reprobate is used to describe those who are not part of the elect. But even that can vary, because there are some Calvinists who believe in double predestination, which is to say God actively predestines people to hell. And then there's other Calvinists, and I tend to be more in this camp, which is to say that God only actively predestines on one end, leaving the rest to just be according to their own will. Which even then, it's like that's even further complicated by ideas of like, compatibilism and stuff like that. Then you got the new independent fundamentalist Baptists, and they would say, you know, if you're one of the people listed in Romans 1, then you're a reprobate. So they don't think homosexuals can be saved, for example, which is just baffling to me. I mean, that's. And anyways, I won't get on that. And then you have the traditionalist Baptist view of reprobation is that human beings are reprobate from the womb and become unreprobate by virtue of being saved, which is not 100% crazy if you think about it. Like, there's obviously.
But let me just butt in really quick. This is like this is my criticism to a lot of Baptists. They take these words that are different words and they like essentially make them all mean the same thing. Like that means like total depravity means a reprobate and a backslider are basically the same thing, unless you say a backslider is a saved person in sin or something. But like it's like, look, born again, regenerate, sanctification, things like that. They have nuanced different meanings. I feel like they just throw them all into a bed. Oh, I'm born again. I'm because I say so. It's just like, doesn't it mean something?
It'll be good. I'll just be real short and read the verse. In Titus 1:15-16, unto the pure, all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure, but even their mind and conscience is defiled. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable, sort of late, and disobedient, and to every good work reprobate.
Yeah, and that actually gets to the foundational question, which is, what does the word reprobate actually mean? Or its Greek equivalent. What it means is rejected.
Yeah, totally, because they're rejecting good works. Like they've
exactly.
jettisoned it. And you know what? That's that Titus. If you're free grace out there, like what Praise has been talking about lately, and all of those guys, just rip it out of there. Just rip it on out. It's not for you.
I know it said their conscience is defiled. That's why I keep on stressing the conscience. Keep a tender conscience. Don't offend your own conscience.
Do you guys want to hear it? This is a little bit random, but you just reminded me when you brought up free grace. You guys want to hear something that's super interesting? That just gave me the chuckles all night last night. So I've been arguing with these guys about the law of Moses and how we're apparently not under it, even though that whatever. I mean, it's just nonsense. But did you know that the first antinomian, they call him, you know what his doctrine actually was? He said that Christians were no longer under the law of Moses, and that while it was true that the rest of the world was, because they weren't saved, for the Christian, the law of Moses was meaningless. And I
wow.
To say that I chuckled was an understatement, because it was like, that's 100% what the abrogationist believes. Now we've developed long enough that the free gracers and the abrogationists are different, but
boy, that's
like their forefather is the same guy. Yeah, he has this quote. He says,
Who is
the Ten Commandments belong in the courthouse, not in the pulpit, to the gallows with Moses. Which is like, wow, that's
just a misunderstanding. Well, you know what? To me it seems, and people don't want to hear this, and they think I don't know what I'm talking about, but it's just sophisticated Marcionism. It really is. It's just a more sophisticated, it's got some makeup smeared on it, and it's a little more. It uses a little bit better Christianese or whatever, but it is the same sort of thing. Look, so there's the people who conceptually disagree with what I'm saying, but they understand what it means to be loving. But I was thinking about this, something I don't think people consider, and that's part of the reason why I made that video about the with the Thomas Sowell in it. If you guys didn't watch it, you should watch it, because then I read Martin Luther's shorter catechism at the end, and the idea is that look, there's different classes and there's different periods in history where today, if you grew up in a astute house or whatever, where you went to school and your parents took care of you really well and you had nice things and a pretty decent childhood, and 2-parent home in the suburbs, and
and everything went fairly well, you know, as well as they do or whatever. Not that you had it, you're so, you know, I'm not saying everybody has hard things that happen to them in life. I just mean like if your life, you just have a upper middle class family that it's well to do, and your parents have a good family, you know, you have everything you could dream of or whatever, and you get married, it's just like, and you have money and good for you, and you've earned it, and I'm not saying anything wrong with that. It's great. I would hope that for everyone. But my point is just that, like, you might, you know, having the commandments or whatever may not be is necessary because you're like but that's like the fruit of in society of like what we've gotten in the West from biblical principles. And so, but if you're like in a broken home and you don't have good like a father figure, you know, it's like a church with a little bit of rules might actually do you some good, like actually like what God wants for you, you know, like for society, even like one family at a time.
Save you from death. I mean, a physical death, that alone, spiritual.
Yeah, it's actually good. God actually, like, it's actually like it is a individual personal thing somewhat, right? But of course the civil powers enforce like murder and stealing and things, but like, you know, it may not seem as necessary, like if you have a certain, you know, family home and you live in the right area with money or whatever. And I'm not trying to say anything's wrong with that. I'm just saying, like, if you live in Africa and there's, you know, in a place with no money and it's destitute or wherever, the ghetto in, you know, wherever in Kansas City or whatever, wherever, it doesn't matter. Race has nothing to do with it. My point is just that, like, at different times in history, we have to think about the consequences about what we're saying the Bible's teaching. Like, we live at different places in different times, and like it doesn't necessarily make sense that like you can give a one fit thing and expect that to be the answer in every circumstance, I guess is my point. That's something I was thinking about. Never had struck me before that, like, yeah, that's a really interesting.
But we do know that, you know, in the latter days that they're going to call evil good and good evil, and evil is going to increase. As far as the times, you know, differences in the times. Well, we were talking about verses that say that we actually can obey. And when I was reading Titus, I looked on the other side, 2 Timothy 4:18. Now, imagine saying this on YouTube to people and what you'd be called, okay? This is Paul, he said, "And the Lord shall deliver me from every evil work." Can you imagine saying that and what people would call you? If you know, because they're going to say you're boasting that you can't sin. The Lord shall deliver me from every evil work, you know? Like,
yeah, you might be called priggish or like self-righteous.
Well, or hyper Puritan. That's the latest.
Oh, is that the new one?
Hyper Puritan.
Man, how do you? I mean, I have no patience for that person anymore. I spent so much time with him, showing him so many things, and he seemed to get it, and then he just turns on a dime, and then like it's so embarrassing. It's and sad because people listen to that.
I think it's funny because like when people say stuff like hyper Puritan, first off, like being essentially a Reformed Baptist, I only say essentially because I am non-denominational, but that's pretty much where my views align. It's like, my guy, that ain't the insult you think it is, because those are literally my spiritual forefathers. But then, like, they do this all the time too. Like, this guy Aaron has been commenting on my streams saying, "Dude, you're making the same arguments that the Hebrew roots make," and I'm like, okay. Maybe they're just right. Have you ever considered that?
Yeah, do you know that's a total fallacy that you're saying that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like that doesn't like this notion
like association, like as if that's bad.
Right.
Well, it's also like, where's the even like? You're right that guilt by association is not valid, but it's also like, where you have this idea that the Puritans and the Hebrew roots? I mean, we're in this room with the Hebrew roots right now. Yahoo! I don't get what the problem is. It's my brothers in Christ. Like, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's just doesn't make any sense to me. It's like these insults you guys are making, they're really not the insults that you think they are. I am literally the descendant of Puritans, if you want to talk about my spiritual beliefs. Like, that is where the Reformed Baptist tradition comes through. So
I wonder what they'd say about the martyrs, man. What do you? I really want to interact with somebody on that. It just strikes me as like a brick wall too. Like the way they say the things they say, I'm just thinking like,
what would you say? Like, what do you think of that? Like that young girl who like got shot by the Columbine killers when she said she was a Christian, willing to go to her death. I mean, I hate to see
I'll
kids
take
do
it
that.
one further, dude. If these guys like, because they'll always like quote mine for something that fits their view. If they actually sat down and read like Martin Luther's On the Bondage of the Will, or listened to R.C. Sproul, The Tyranny of the Weaker Brother, or read Against Heresy's Irenaeus or something like that, like actually read the whole thing, I think they'd melt. You know what I mean? Like I don't think they could actually handle.
Well, I know
reading.
what they'll do. They'll say they're Catholic.
Yeah.
Or what about Pilgrim's Progress? You know, that used to be used
Yeah.
the main books for schooling. And I'm just going to assume that many of them would not tolerate that book.
Oh no, yeah, I 100% agree. There's no way they could. And by the way, John Bunyan was a Puritan.
Yeah.
Yeah, Catholic,
That's
right?
what made me
Catholic.
think of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're Catholics. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, I don't think they would be able to handle him at all. I mean, and then
Dude,
at that
like
point,
your church 100 years ago, I guess they're Catholic too.
yeah, right.
They literally say that. They think that. They believe that. They think basically if you're not free grace, you're Catholic.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about it too is like, so I was recently, looking at some of the early modern American evangelical Baptists. Of course, Schofield is the go-to, but even Billy Sunday and Bob Jones, and a lot of these guys. I mean, and reading their writings, even these are guys from the 1900s in the Baptist community. It's like Bob Jones would vomit all over praise if he ever met him.
No,
And
I know.
say that,
No, everybody in their tradition 50 years ago would say they need to be converted.
Yeah, exactly. They'd say you guys are not believers. No believer would actually say this stuff.
Is that the Bob Jones that had people use their curriculum for homeschooling?
Yeah, well,
he also opened
the college, right?
Bob Jones University,
Okay.
which got in a lot of controversy because he was from the South and he was kind of a racist.
He taught no interracial marriage, right?
Yeah, he did, and he also thought that schools shouldn't be. The thing is, look, I'm not here to excuse Bob because that was sin, and he knows it better than any of us now because he's passed. But I do think we have to be a little bit historically sympathetic.
Yep, I agree totally.
Like I, as much as I hate to admit it, I really think that it would be very difficult for me if I was born in 1899 in Nashville, Tennessee. It's like statistically speaking, I would probably be racist. You know what I mean? And that's a harsh thing to admit, but we're really blessed to live in a time where that's not normal.
Right. I agree. I think it's very hard for people to have that mindset that you made that. I've heard you say that a long time ago. And I thought, that's really wise. And that's hard to put yourself back in that day where you are just totally brainwashed in a sense, in a different manner.
Yeah, totally.
No, that's where humility comes in. It's the same thing. Like if you were born in Nazi Germany, that doesn't mean you excuse the evil. It just means you're realistic about reality. And so that's why we should always be careful about it. That's charity and humility is important things. Like you don't say it's okay. You just recognize. I think that's the grounded way to understand that we're all sinners, sort of thing. You don't use that to excuse the sin.
Right.
You use it. You use it to be realistic and to be charitable as best you can, while standing up against evil at the same time. You can do both.
Right. Correct with meekness. I mean, that's throughout the whole Bible. When you correct, when you rebuke, do it with meekness and humility.
It's so hard.
Oh yeah, I know. Especially when people poke at you for 2 years before you have an explosion, right, Jamie?
Yeah.
Yeah. No kidding.
I don't want to fake it either, but it's like that's where sometimes it's just kind of like easy to be like, I don't want to be a fraud. Let me show you how I really feel.
And unfortunately, a lot of people haven't heard when you've repented and said that, you are sorry. But I've heard it. I've heard it a lot of times. But
Yeah, I know. Like I really try to avoid the drama stuff. I really do. Like I don't pay a lot of attention to it usually. Like, and people come at me like, I know Bruce is all mad at me. It's like, dude, I really don't even want to. I don't even want to go there. Like, I guess there's a point though. Like, if people have offended each other, it's not okay to just ignore. So I'm kind of torn with that. I just don't want to get sucked into that.
the only good thing for you, and I don't know if you heard, Eric said he's taking it harder than anyone right now, Eric Leinhardt. And he said that he would probably take that position so that you and me and other people aren't bothered as much,
Yeah, I'm realizing
That's
how
what's
much
happening.
I don't pay attention to a lot of these people's channels until recently when I'm really starting to see like everybody all
Oh,
freaking out about stuff. I decided to take a look. I didn't even know that people were so conniving, like going on. Like I
Well, I
wasn't
knew
aware.
you didn't pay attention because you were saying some people were really nice and sweet, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, poor kid, he's not listening.
Yeah, that's probably true. Like I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like I didn't realize Bill had it in for me so bad until I actually started looking at his channel.
No,
Like
it's
I
bad.
had no idea. Like he was so offended that I called him a pig that one time. But dude, he comes on my channel and puts like crude things up, like says the nastiest stuff. And like I called him a pig to try to make a point. I think I
And
even said he used a swear word too in there. But I was like, okay, fine. I'm self-righteous. Fine. Then I call him a pig. I'm like, okay, well, you're a pig. You're disgusting because sin doesn't matter. Okay, fine. But it's like, and then as soon as you say one thing, they go around. Look, they're so pleased with themselves to like think that they got me mad to say something back after they're just like hounding me. And then I say something back to make a point, and then they're like so proud of themselves that they like broke me. See, he's
Right.
bad. It's just like, dude,
Right.
are you kidding me?
Right.
Like, what are you?
But
So
see,
I love the other.
go
Sorry,
ahead. No, go ahead, CJ.
Thank you. I on that note, I was baffled the other day when you were reviewing his video, and he's saying, I don't know any free gracers who treat people the way you guys treat people, calling pigs. And I was like, and excuse my French, guys, but I was like, really, large shit salvation? You don't know anybody who talks like that? Like, you know what I mean? Like that's amazing. I feel like I'm listening to somebody who talks like that, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. And for those who don't know that phrase I just said, I won't repeat it again, but that originated from Bill, who said that's like
Right.
that's a little like tongue in cheek, I guess, if you want to call it that, dig on lordship, which is just disgusting in and of itself, because it's like that's, you're talking about the lordship of Christ and you're referring
Exactly.
See, I went into that saying I'm going to be nice. I'm just going to critique the ideas. And then, of course, like I get like 20 minutes in and I started noticing that I was being kind of just like shocked and kind of disgusted in a way, but not in a terrible, like disgusted. I just mean like, just like in awe at the ridiculous things that were being said. Like it was just propaganda, like ridiculous, like catchphrases and like these outrageous claims about everybody's Catholic. And then I found myself kind of getting disgusted and hearing it in the tone of my voice. And then I was like, then I kind of felt guilty. And then the third stage of shock was then I started to just kind of like feel sorry for like how ridiculous what they were saying was. And I started to realize they kind of believe it. And then I kind of started feeling sorry for them. And then I felt bad about feeling sorry for them, that I felt like I was patronizing them. And then I had to just stop listening to it.
You're
Those were the stages of grief for me. And like, and I do not, the worst is feeling sorry for somebody, because I don't want to patronize them. I really don't. And so I had to stop listening to it.
Yeah, I'm laughing, but I don't think it's funny at all. I've been with this for years, and it's to the point now we have women threatening to take lordship people to court. Okay. And so at this level, when it's just not working out, hanging out together, to me,
I know what you're talking about. That was a little bit of manic kind of.
Yeah,
around there. I
but
think.
it's been happened more than once. Okay. So the thing is, it's better, in my opinion, to have separate streams. Okay, you guys hang out and then we'll hang out so that you can go through the word, worship together, discuss these things, get something done. And then instead of trying to be together and the whole thing is just discord, you know?
That's probably right on. You like if everybody was just had a little more couth or whatever, just like a little more, um, I don't know, just acceptance, I guess, is just the difference, I suppose.
Yeah, just say, okay, we disagree. Okay. Let's continue reading, but okay, we
Yeah.
disagree. You know, you know.
Yes, that's right. Any more verses for us, Janet, before I close it down? Because I'm getting tired.
You're getting tired and it's 4 a.m. here. What time is it there?
It is 1 o'clock.
Okay, but you're a working man, so you need
Yeah, I
to.
got to work tomorrow. I got to work early, but you always have some good verses. So anything you want to say, everybody, I'll give everybody a last word. Thanks for coming.
It's a blessing to be here. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I feel like I barged in and interrupted.
I wish you would more often.
I get so excited and then because I don't get to come on very often, but thank you for not calling me out as a Jezebel. And it was just great talking with you guys. I ask the Lord to bless each one of you and your families. Good night.
Come on every time.
Good night to the side chat too. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
God bless.
Love you. All right, Yahoo, you're up. Any thoughts on anything, or just any parting words or verses or message you want to give?
Yahoo!
Yahoo! I guess
Back
he's
in
gone.
2005.
He died. Yeah. I didn't think you were born back then.
I'm not that young.
I know. You're like you were a babe in swaddling clothes.
Yeah.
I really want to get that. I really want to repeat. I'm going to say it for Yahoo. I'll just say this to the free gracers out there. You are a late term, or what's the term when they're in the womb too long? What do you call that? Late birth. You're a late birth. I can see. I just picture a woman on the operating table now. Paste John Calvin's cartoon meme face on the woman's face. He's giving birth, and he's has a weird expression on his face, and then Rosemary's baby like plops out. The camera's down on the ground, and you just see like the stirrups, and like this demon thing like plops out like a alien egg, and like it stands up, and it's like a little baby. It has teeth and little beady red eyes and teeth in its mouth, and it bites off the umbilical cord and then scampers off, and you hear the little footprints, and it runs into the closet, and the closet has little like a grate on it, and so you can see through the little things, and there's bloody footprints running to it that you just heard scamper over to the closet, and it's peering back with like a evil smile on its face, but like with its eyebrows down and the little beady red eyes you can see through the closet door. And it's looking at the mother, and the umbilical cord still flailing around, splashing everywhere. That is free grace, and John Calvin is the mother. And it hates its mother. It wants to bite her toes off, and it really doesn't even recognize that it's its own mother. And it's really strayed from, and it owes everything to its mother, but it's strayed and gone totally evil. That's how I picture it.
So I don't mind that. I would just simply say that, old Johnny Boy is a male, but no, I get you.
I mean, we're talking abstract here. It's just I didn't do it very good justice that time, but I'm trying to get my thing down because my point is just that like you got to recognize the history of the church to some degree and understand like I mean, they really need. I really believe that it's totally, what's the word? It's just off the rails, like, but not recognizing where it comes from, sort of thing. And it's not even that it's totally wrong. Like they're right about justification and what merits your salvation. That's all true. It's just going off the rails with that idea.
Yeah, and
You can
totally.
disagree. It's fine. I want you to critique what I'm saying, but
Well, no, I tend to agree a lot actually. And I guess my biggest thing is I kind of feel that way about most non-Calvinist Protestants. I think all y'all are not the same because free grace is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the bunch. But I see, the SDAs and the Oneness Pentecostals and the regular Pentecostals and the Methodists and the Baptists, and it's like all these guys are just children of the Reformation, and then the Reformed are just kind of sitting back here like, yeah, those are my kids.
well, we
I
should
don't really know
argue
what
that
happened once
sometime.
they turned 18 and left the house, but there they are.
Yeah, I would imagine you would feel that way, and that's cool. I would just say, sorry, I told you there was I'm cutting you off here and then interrupting, but I would like to talk more about that because I think the one thing that people miss about the Reformation is, and it's why they say we're all Catholic if we're not free grace. The thing is, it is justification by faith. I would say is the main issue, but besides that, of course, the different groups are going to disagree if the difference is right, but I would still say that is the important thing, and that's what binds us together as Protestants and the derivatives thereof. But you can go off the rails in all sorts of ways. I would just say it's not simply that they put something in front of justification by faith, although that is the problem. But there's also the fact that people take that and they think that they look where they've gone with it. It's actually, what is it? This is what I wanted to mention. So I'm glad you brought that up, or you mentioned that, because I wanted to point this out too. I did a thing where I looked through a bunch of places in the New Testament where it talks about when it gives that phrase, let no man deceive you by any means, let no man deceive you. Like that's like a emphasis, right? Like listen up, because someone's going to try to, it's prophecy in a way, right? When you look at all those verses, they're either about righteousness, let no man deceive you. He who does righteous. So in case you thought righteousness is simply about imputation and just insert Jesus wherever it says you should be righteous. Like in case you're deceived and you think that's all that means, which that's true, but it also means, no, it's really true that God wants you to do righteous acts in your salvation, right? Like you doing righteous acts is righteous, just like Jesus is righteous. It says that. It says, let no man deceive you by any means, for the man of lawlessness will be revealed. Notice literally the Antichrist, that was the spirit was already in the church, in the Gnostics and stuff, in the New Testament, in the early church. That is predicting, that comes from Daniel 7, dude. And what does it say? What is this man of lawlessness? Paul's getting that from Daniel. He is the one that comes out of Rome. And notice they went out from us because they were not of us. He's talking about this group that has the spirit of lawlessness. And that man of sin, son of perdition, who the Lord Jesus will destroy at the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth, that's the Antichrist. That's the one who enforces the mark of the beast. And he's from Daniel 7. And in Daniel 7, he speaks blasphemies against the Most High, and he seeks to change times and laws. That's in context of he's lawless. So he's talking about God's law. He is. That's undeniable. And so many of those verses that have that, let no man deceive you, have to do with Matthew 24 and their corollaries. And it's either talking about, let no man deceive you, like you reap what you sow. Let no man deceive you about righteousness. Let no one deceive you, like sin is transgression of the law, basically. Like John says it in the first epistles too, right? In several places. It's like, it warns you, let no man deceive you. Righteousness, like God's calling you to obedience. You'll reap what you sow. The man of lawlessness, like sin is the transgression of the law. Like God wants you to obey. And so it's like, do righteousness, don't do evil. Sin is bad. And it's characterized by the spirit of the lawless one. And like, it's staring you in the face all throughout the New Testament over and over and over and over. And people miss that. I thought that, for me, that was very striking. Sorry, go ahead. I'm done.
You're totally good, man. It's your channel. And I'm not saying that like in a patronizing way. I'm serious. It's like, if you want to.
Do you think? Have you ever thought about that? The Antichrist is his spirit is already there in the early church, and he calls him the man of sin, the man of lawlessness, the son of perdition. who Jesus is going to destroy.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have. I tend to think that because of my views on like where who the Antichrist is. Excuse me. Wow. I have usually thought of the Antichrist as being probably a little bit more legalistic in some senses, although also lawless in others. But that has been changing recently, especially with the way the culture is going. I start to wonder, is that because I can't imagine a enemy of Christ that is more demonic than what the secular world is trying to become. It's not there yet, but it's very much trying to get there. And in certain ways, we're already so like unbelievably depraved, right? Like I don't think we've had a society that has sexualized women to the extent that we do in modern America and Europe today, ever. Like and
But CJ, have you noticed though that in the Bible, like I'm not sure it has the secular world in view. It says it's a woman, it's a harlot. That means
well, here's the thing: the secular world is made up of a lot of, because this is what makes this modern age so peculiar. The secular world is made up of a bunch of professing believers. You know what I mean? Like Cardi B claims that she is a devout Catholic. That's a fact. So like we're in a weird time where the pornography industry and those who are committing acts of violence against foreigners and those who are endorsing genital mutilation of children and all that, like these are all people who are progressive Christians. Now, of course, they're also highly against Christianity in many ways. Interestingly enough, we were talking about Paul earlier, and a lot of people are, a lot of people are anti-Paul on the law side, but a lot of people are anti-Paul on the hatred for law side too. Like you'll say, well, 1 Corinthians 6:9 says these will not inherit the kingdom of God, and they'll say, yeah, but that wasn't Jesus, that's Paul. You know what I mean? I want to know what Jesus has to say on the issue. And it's like, that's Jesus is a prophet of Jesus, so this is what you get. At any rate, so it's like it's a weird time in history where the professing Christian world and the professing Catholic world, and even other adjacent religions like professing Mormon world and so on, is made up of a bunch of people who are diametrically opposed to the religion, and sometimes even audibly so. Which I think is kind of indicative of where we're headed. I mean, consider this. This is kind of a little bit of a rant, but like consider the fact that Pope Francis has been saying, and me and you are, of course, not of the position that Catholics are Christians, but just consider this. Pope Francis has been calling together interfaith religious prayers with Muslims and Yazidis and Baha'is and Rastafari, and has been putting pro-choice advocates and LGBT activists in positions of power or having them write forwards of his book, and has been saying things like, if if the atheist man baptized his son, then maybe he's going to heaven. And this guy is supposed to be the representative of the largest quote unquote Christian church in the world. Now, again, I don't think that Catholicism is Christian. However, if that is not a sign of the times, I don't know what could possibly be. You know what I mean? And I don't think it's a coincidence that politically and culturally speaking, the only guys on the front lines of defending this tend to be the evangelical Christians, with some exceptions. There's Matt Walsh's, who's a Catholic, or Ben Shapiro, who's a Jew. But, anyways, that's a big rant. I'm sorry. Well, what were we? We were supposed to be making closing statements. So
you're fine. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go ahead and read an excerpt from an article titled "The Law of God" by the late great R.C. Sproul. Sproul published this article, I think, just before he died, if I remember correctly, which was only like 2017. And it's pretty awesome to hear from our perspective, and it's like nails on chalkboard to those who, while they very much claim to admire men like Sproul and C.S. Lewis and John Wesley and etc., would nevertheless be diametrically opposed to these kinds of views. And listen to this quotation here. He says, "We are living in an era in which the law of God is not given much attention either by secularists or by Christians. The law, we assume, is a relic of the past, part of the history of Judeo-Christianity to be sure, but of no abiding relevance to the Christian life. We are living out in practice the antinomian heresy." A recent survey by George Gallup Jr. revealed a startling trend in our culture. According to Gallup, the evidence seems to indicate that there is not clear behavioral patterns that distinguish Christians from non-Christians in our society. We all seem to be marching to the same drummer, looking to the shifting standards of contemporary culture for the basis of what is acceptable conduct. What everybody else is doing seems to be our only ethical norm. This pattern can only emerge in a society or church wherein the law of God is eclipsed. The very word law seems to have an unpleasant ring to our evangelical circles. Try an experiment. Cite a few passages from Psalm 119 for our reflection. I'm asking you to read them existentially in the sense that you try to crawl into the skin of the writer and experience empathy. Try to feel what he felt when he wrote these lines thousands of years ago. These are the lines. "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day." Psalm 119:97. "Your testimonies I have taken as a heritage forever, for they are rejoicing of my heart. I have inclined my heart to perform your statutes forever to the very end." Psalm 119:111-112. "I opened my mouth and panted, for I longed for your commandments." Psalm 119:131. "Trouble and anguish have overtaken me, yet your commandments are my delights." Psalm 119:143. Now this is back to Sproul. "Does this sound like a modern Christian? Do we hear people talk about longing passionately for the law of God? Do we hear our friends expressing joy and delight in God's commandments? These sentiments are foreign to our culture. Some will surely say, but that was Old Testament stuff. We've been redeemed from the law. Now our focus is on the gospel and not the law. So let's continue the experiment. Let's read some excerpts from another biblical writer, only this time from the New Testament. Let's hear from a man who loved the gospel, preached it, and taught it as much as any mortal. Let's hear from Paul. Quote, "But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter." Romans 7:6. "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would have not known sin except through the law." Romans 7:8. "Therefore the law is holy and the commandment holy, just, and good." Romans 7:12. "For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man." Romans 7:22. Back to Sproul. "Does this sound like a man who believed the law of God has no place in the Christian life? Read Paul carefully and you will find a man whose heart longed for the law of God as much as David's. Church history witnesses that at periods of revival and reformation there has been profound awakening to the sweetness of God's law that can easily degenerate into legalism, which usually provokes a response of antinomianism. Neither is biblical." Get this here. This is the kicker of the whole article, and I'll even stop after this. "The law drives us to the gospel. The gospel saves us from the curse of the law. But in turn, it directs us back to the law to search out its spirit, its goodness, and its beauty. The law of God is still a lamp unto our feet. Without it, we will stumble and trip and grope in the darkness." Now, friends and family, that is the great late R.C. Sproul, the guy who is considered by many the forefather of systemic theology, the guy who is considered by many to be the leading apologist of the 1900s, although some would argue for guys like C.S. Lewis, who also has a high view of the law, by the way. Read The Abolition of Man. You can't be saying you hold the teachings of these men in high regard if you're not going to at least acknowledge, whether you disagree or agree, that they were quote unquote law dogs, as you like to refer to my good friend Jamie here. The first person to say the law of Moses wasn't binding in Christian history was also known as the first antinomian, and his name was Johann Agricola. And beyond that, it wasn't until Douglas Moo and N.T. Wright, Douglas Moo with his New Covenant theology and N.T. Wright with his new perspectives on Paul. In the 1900s, in fact, the late 1900s, that those ideas were revived again. Because all of church history agreed that the law of Moses is binding on Christians. It is binding in the moral law in that is an eternal law. It is binding in the ceremonial aspects in that each of those have literal fulfillment in Christ, and therefore we literally obey those by way of our belief in Christ, right? What does Paul say? We keep the festival not with the leaven of malice, but with the leaven of kindness and sincerity. Or in the case of the civil law, in that the general equity is still binding upon us today. This is the universal understanding of Christian history. The Church Fathers, the Reformers, the early Baptists, the R.C. Sproul's, the C.S. Lewis's, the A.W. Tozers, and etc. If you have the position that the abrogationist takes, that the law is not binding on us, or even worse, taking the position that the Court of Jude takes, that we don't have to be submitted to Christ in any sense.
We lost him. I'll finish it off for him. Sounds like your phone was dying, CJ. Yeah. So the love of God is the law of God. You can make that connection through Romans and 1 John. And Jesus' own words. Over and over and over. If you love me, keep my commandments. And I'll remind you, Jesus was teaching before the law was ratified. And he admonishes his disciples to go ye therefore into all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all the things that I have taught you. He says in John 14, I have obeyed my Father's commandments, and I did not bring my own, but I brought my Father's, and I have obeyed him. And then now he who hears and does my sayings, me and my Father will come and abide with him. Abide in me, and I in you. And he says, this is the love of the Father, that you love one another. If you love me, keep my commandments. You can't love somebody without keeping the commandments. And like John 17:33 says this. This is eternal life, that they may know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ whom he sent. Knowing God, Jesus says to the ones that he shuts out in Matthew 25, to the ones who get the door shut in their face in Matthew 7. I never knew you. And I've noticed this about a lot of people. They don't finish Jesus' quote. He just says 3 more words or whatever, 5 more words. But people leave it off for some reason. And then they don't even realize they're doing it. They point to, they said they did this. They said they did that. Jesus says, I never knew you. I never knew you. And they never say the last part, workers of lawlessness. So you might ask, Jesus says, I didn't know you. And people forget that he says workers of lawlessness. The man of sin, who Jesus destroys at his second coming, is called the man of lawlessness. So to know God is eternal life. Jesus says, I never knew you, workers of lawlessness. The man of the number 666 is called the man of lawlessness. To know God is to have eternal life. To not know God is to be lawless. If you love me, keep my commandments. If you do what I say, me and my Father will come abide with you. You must abide, he says in John 15. And John says, so we might ask, so if that isn't clear, you could ask the Bible a question. How can I know that I know you? How can I know that I know God? How can I know it? I want to know. I want to know. It says, it answers that. Hereby we know that we know him. If we love him and love the brethren, this is how they'll know you're my disciples, if you love one another, as I have loved you. But he says, this is how we know that we know him, if we love him and keep his commandments. In the book of Revelation, over and over, after talking about those who go to hell, it says, this is the patience of the saints. Here are those ones, the saints, they keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus, the testimony of Jesus. After Jesus ascends into heaven in Revelation 12, it says, this is how, it says, and the devil was wroth with the woman, the people of God. After Jesus ascended, the devil's wroth with the woman and goes to make war with the remnant of her seed. Children of Abraham. Paul says we're children of Abraham by faith. So the devil's wroth with the woman and goes to make war with the remnant of her seed because he knows his time is short, who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. Blessed are those who do his commandments, for they shall have right to enter into the city. I didn't say it, the Bible says it. God bless. All the best to you.